Hello everyone and welcome to our Inquiring Minds. Today's episode of the Writing Literacy podcast focuses on Asian diaspora scholars' understanding of literacy. I am Zixin, your host for this Spring 2026 episode today. We are very delighted to welcome Dr. Betina Hsieh, whose work centers on teacher identity, Asian American experiences, and 21st century literacy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Betina Hsieh. As Zixin mentioned, my pronouns are she, her, ta, and I am a professor at the University of Washington.
And Dr. Tairan Qiu, a longtime friend of our Writing Literacy podcast, whose research focuses on transnational literacy and new literacies. We are so happy to have her back with us.
My name is Tairan Qiu, Tairan, and my pronouns are she, her, and ta. I currently work at Stanford University as an assistant professor of ELA and literacy education.
And Dr. Wan Shun Eva Lam, whose work focuses on literacies in transnational and digital contexts and educational storytelling on migration.
Northwestern University in the School of Education Social Policy. And I came to the U.S. when I was 17. My family migrated then to the Bay Area, and I had also taught English and bilingual classes in San Francisco.
And Dr. Jiadi Zhang, whose work centers on translanguage literacy and teacher education.
My name is Jiadi Zhang. I'm assistant professor of literacy at University of Missouri, St. Louis.
I'm Hein, Zixin's co-host. The Writing and Literacy podcast is dedicated to showcasing scholarly work, engaging with current issues and encouraging conversation among members of the special interest group and the broader writing and literacy community. Our goal is to create a space for dialogue across institutions, bringing together faculty, graduate students, and others interested in timely topics in writing, literacy, and education more broadly.
And then reflect on our opening question for today. So how do you define literacy in your own scholarly work? And what experiences, questions, or moments led you to focus your research on this understanding of literacy?
In my definition of literacy, I draw from the Freirean definition of critical literacies as broadly encompassing the skills and practices citizens need not only to read written text, but also to read and interpret the world around them, including in digital contexts. So critical literacies are concerned with what is said, how discourses are presented, by whom, in whose interest, and for what purposes. I see critical literacies as deeply connected to identity, power, and agency, as they go simply beyond recognizing socio-political contexts that give symbols particular meanings, but also encourage readers or meaning makers to act in transformative ways as they engage in the world around them. And so I was reflecting on this question and on what moments led me to approaching literacy in this way in relation to Asian diasporic communities. And there are a few moments. So we were talking a little bit earlier about a study that I did with my colleague, Dr. Jung Kim, who is in Chicago. And we did a study using Asian critical race theory to engage with the experiences of Asian American teachers. And that made me think a lot about how Asian American teachers read their worlds as educators and how they are read or positioned as educators across various contexts. The second kind of major experience for me was the COVID-19 pandemic and witnessing the ways in which rhetoric around the Asian diasporic community, particularly around Chinese diasporic people, devolved in real time and the consequences of that rhetoric on physical violence. And then I think my big experiences, or my experiences as a mother, which I'll probably talk about more later in the podcast, have really shaped the way I think about literacy. It's made me consider the way that my children are read themselves, how they read the world, and how they are given or not given opportunities to engage authentically with texts that speak to them and can help them to develop a critical worldview.
Thank you for starting us off with that powerful overview, Betina. And then reflecting on the opening question about how I define literacy, I understand literacy as reading and writing the world through the Ferrerian perspective. But to me, literacy is how students, how young people, how their family members read and write the world. Yes, traditionally how they read and write the world through decoding and encoding letters and words, right? But it's more importantly to me, it's how they make sense of the world and how they compose about the world. So to me, storytelling between a grandma and a young girl is literacy practices. The grandma teaching the girl to sing is a literacy practice. Young people engaging in cooking, learning recipes from their elders, that is also a literacy practice. In addition to these familial practices of literacy, to me, critical media literacy, like how young people advocate for the causes and things that they believe in online and in their communities. These critical literacy practices to me are also how these young people read and write the world. So thinking about how like moments that led me to focus on this research and understanding of literacy, it's really my learning and unlearning practice. Because growing up, I was an English language learner when I was classified and labeled as an English language learner when my family immigrated to Canada when I was 8 years old. And then when I was 11 years old, we moved back to China and I was deemed illiterate in Chinese. So I was deemed illiterate in English and then I was deemed illiterate in Chinese. And then coming to the United States for college as an international student, I felt like the literacy practices that I engage in and was taught with my family members, like the gossiping, storytelling, the cooking, like all these beautiful practices were left behind or left outside of the classroom door. And then when I went into the classroom, I had to read in English, I had to read academic language, I had to write academic papers. And there was really this dichotomy between what I understood, the literacy practices I embodied as a person, an immigrant, an East Asian woman, and then the literacy practices that was valued in the classrooms. So thinking about this experience, it really shaped my whole drive behind my research agenda, is really talking to teachers, teacher educators, families, communities, and not showing them that they have these literacy practices, because they're experts in their literacy practices, but challenging the social educational discourse, what counts as literacy and what doesn't count as literacy, and also working with these communities in seeing the value of the vibrant literacies that they have and embody.
The idea of reading the world and rewriting the world from Paulo Freire was formative for me in my graduate school years. And my understanding of this has been expanded through the work of critical race scholars who illuminated the relation of literacy to structural racism, racial ideologies, counter storytelling, and restorying. The work that Betina is doing and Tairan as well. In that sense, in this broader, just a canvas of work that people are doing, I think of my work as really been about rewriting our relations in the world. And this is definitely the opportunity to work with young people. And I've worked more extensively with youth of Chinese descent, and more recently with Latinx youth in collaboration with my colleagues to study their transnational relations and literacies. And that has involved observational studies, hanging out, getting to know them and their immediate practices in their everyday lives. And more recently, really listening and understanding more in depth the kinds of narratives they tell in their everyday lives, in our interviews, right? The stories they tell, paying attention to how the young people take up different positionings and points of view as they sustain and renew their relationships with people across geopolitical borders, and how they make sense of societal issues. I'm coming to see this as the youth as a way of that in which the youth are rewriting their relationality in the world, and a lot of I'm so grateful for my colleagues here who share their personal experiences, and I would love to say a few words about that. And another question about positionality, but I feel like as an older person, I feel like my own coming to understand my own transnational belonging really was propelled by teaching, as my work as a teacher in San Francisco, working with young people, and who opened my eyes to their transnational digital practices. And that was in the 2000s. It was so early, and really, kind of my own development of my identity has been in conjunction with learning about them and their lives. So in this work, I'll just say one last thing. In this work, I've been inspired by Borderlands theory, kind of work on time and space, rethinking time and space. But I'm also thinking about relationality in indigenous epistemologies and the importance of taking that lens.
I was born and raised in China, and I completed my undergraduate studies in China. But in my final year, I got the opportunity to participate in an exchange program in Seoul, Korea. So that is the first time I left my home country. And after that, I came to US to pursue my master's degree, PhD degree. And looking back on my own journey, literacy for me, again, like y'all mentioned, it's not only the ability to read and write the text, right, written in Mandarin, Chinese, written in English, Korean. For me, it's also about a way to getting to know the people around me, to building relationships every time when I enter a new place. And it's also about negotiating who I am and where I belong. So as someone with a multilingual and a transnational background, translanguaging, which refers to using our full linguistic and semiotic repertoires for meaning making, is both my everyday literacy practice and also a main focus of my own research. So I work closely with Chinese American children and teachers, and my work centers on the creativity and the criticality of children's literacy practices when they are given the space to use all their language, their cultures, and given the space to allow them to share their transnational experiences. I also focus on teachers and highlight the transformative potential when the teachers take a translanguaging stance in literacy instruction and assessment. So in my previous research, I can see how literacy is deeply personal and political, right? So literacy is connected with their agency, but also how it is intertwined with larger social political environment. And I also see literacy practices always carry the history of the community. It carries their families' expectations. It carries the children's their own struggles, hopes, aspirations, but also serving as an important tool to explore their identity and to reimagine their futures.
Thank you all for sharing your definitions and stories about literacy. As we've heard, literacy goes beyond reading and writing. It is deeply connected to identity, culture, and the ways people make meaning in their lives and communities. Now, I would like to dive deeper and ask our second question. How have various literacy practices, for example, transnational, multilingual, digital, and everyday or informal literacies, reshape what counts as lyricists for the Asian and Asian diaspora communities you study? And where do you see schools and universities doing well or still struggling in recognizing these forms of meaning making?
Oh, kind of like connect to what I shared earlier. I work with Chinese American children, and my dissertation research was in a community-based heritage schools. So what I observed in that school is, when children bring the Chinese food and snacks to the school to share with their peers. When they are making pottery together with their parents, they sharing the gifts they brought back from China, and they engaged in learning traditional Chinese dance. So those are all literacy practices for me. And for me personally, I create videos, I create and post videos on social media, and I'm a dancer. So I also think dancing is a literacy practice for self-expression. So I think all these count as literacy because they are creative, they're joyful, and most importantly is that they all matters for the people who engage in them. Well, I think now in schools and universities, the good thing is we are beginning to recognize those multiple forms of literacy. Like we can see, the current scholarship highlight how in teacher education programs we are highlighting the concept like inclusive literacy, digital literacy, critical literacy. Well, many pre-service teachers also understand and appreciate those concepts and trying to implement in their classrooms. But I think when they really go into the schools, I also hear the voices like, I know this is good, but, right? So the teachers also express their concerns. They run into barriers because many times the multilingual ideologies and the standardized curriculum and the tasks in the school system prevent them from implementing those ideas into their practices. So I think the struggle I see is how to translate the theory into practices. How could we collaborate with, our different stakeholders to help create that space to allow students to engage in those diverse practices of literacy. And I think that takes a lot. That takes a lot of collaborations.
Jiadi, thank you for bringing up the multiple levels of change we have to engage in, right? In thinking about how the literacy practices, the community literacy practices of Asian diasporic communities and other folks whose experiences are not reflected and are actively invisibilized in our schools. How can we engage in change at multiple levels? And I feel like it takes a village. It takes many people working at different levels, or not levels, but different spaces, right? To support innovation and transformation that people are doing. So I would say maybe two things. One is how I feel like where my passion, where my sense of commitment is at this time in terms of bringing youth literacies into the learning spaces. And then I just want to share one observation that a couple of colleagues and I were talking about last at the ARA convention last spring, and I just brought it. I just want to bring it up to our space. So one area I'm working on currently is to engage in a co-design work with educators to support storytelling on transnational relations and migration in the classroom. And we've been fortunate to work with several teachers across language arts, history and civics, particularly history and civics educators who work with multilingual students. And also we are starting to co-design a new MENA, Middle Eastern, North African, and Asian literature class that incorporates migration storytelling in a very, in both a space that is brings together people from different communities, but also a space where folks share affinity with each other in terms of some of the historical experiences, but also a space where people can create solidarity and connection. So we have been doing that and creating a migration storytelling curriculum that we can share with more educators. And it's been fascinating to see how some of the things we have been seeing in youth's informal literacies in terms of how they connect communities in their narratives, how they position themselves in different historical times and bringing those observations together. We are seeing that in the classroom. And I just I can share some examples later. I think there's a question about how we see students' practices in this political moment. So I'll share two examples then. But one observation we had last April, that was during a symposium we organized with Dr. Jo-Min Kwon at MSU, and with us we're also Alison Skerritt, Tatiana Klein, and Idalia Nunes. And we were asking around whether teacher education programs, whether we were aware of any teacher education programs that include migration as a topic or as a course. And none of us could think of one. It's not existing in any of the universities that we are working in, any of the teacher education programs that my colleagues are actually teaching in. So it's really it's unbelievable that we are not doing that, especially in this time and with the kind of communities that we have in across cities and towns in the U.S.
So Jiadi and Eva, for sharing your stories and just how you came to this work. So reflecting on this question about what kinds of literacies count as literacy for Asian American communities I work with, I also thought about change, but I started thinking about change because I see these migrants, these young people move here from another country or another region, and then they're inserted into a system and an institution that has their norms or, what's deemed as privileged and not privileged, what's deemed as literacy and what's not literacy. And then, so I think about the humans being injected into a system and institution and how the human beings practices contradicts with the expectations of these institutions. So thinking about my dissertation work, which was a 3-year critical ethnographic study with a Chinese family in Atlanta, I see there's a dichotomy between the girls' literacy practices at home, where she danced like Jiadi, your dancing videos actually reminded me that she did dancing videos like that too. So she danced, she cooks, she's an artist. But when she went to school, like her teacher's comments about her was, "Oh, she's so quiet. She doesn't speak up. She might need more help with her homework." So you can see that contradiction between her vibrant literacy practices and after she's put into this institution, this system, those are not deemed as literacy practices, right? And then thinking about my current project, working with a collective of transnational girls of color. So in Texas, in Houston, I worked with 9 girls, and they're Pakistani, East Asian, South Asian, Latina girls. So we got together to do poetry and to do digital storytelling and to make music as a collective. But I also observed, in a researchy word, but I also witnessed how they engage in literacy practices outside of our collective on the internet and in improv clubs and all these things. And again, I see that dichotomy between what they're practicing, like the critical literacies they're practicing in their communities and what's at school. She's doing these things, but then when she goes to school, she has to conform to what the school is asking them to do, like staring at the 10 commandments every day. And then her literacy practices and all these young people's literacy practices are almost watered down to just what test scores they can get through standardized testing. So thinking about changes that I can make, I really think there's like institutionalized and systemic change is really the answer. teacher education is important, but I think that's a very small part of it, because these teachers we're working with also go in the system and they're challenged with anti-ethnic studies sentiments in California, for example.
So I'll just add in really briefly, I really appreciate what Jiadi and Eva and Tairan all contributed, and I can keep my things short. But I really heard through what they were saying, right, these themes of joy in literacies that are in everyday practices, right, in digital literacies, in seeing oneself in the curriculum. I really appreciated just the types of literacy that Jiadi said that she engages in personally, right? And how Eva mentioned working with teachers around curriculum development, where more students can have authentic exposure to diverse voices with which they can engage. And then when Tairan talked about like what is recognized and what really counts as literacy. So I've been thinking about a lot of those things too. And you know, my previous research did look at critical digital literacy. I'm doing less of that now, just supporting Zixin in doing her work. But I'm really thinking a lot about transnational digital literacy spaces, particularly around social media and Asian diasporic youth use of social media in relation to their literate practices and identity, meaning making, and finding ways of belonging. And I've been thinking about how we don't do a great job of engaging those out of school kind of digital literacy practices within schools, but then I wonder how we can do that authentically. Because I know that when I was a teacher and I was trying to engage these practices, it felt very inauthentic because maybe those spaces aren't meant to be brought into schools. But what I do think is like really important for us to think about is the way that Asian diasporic bodies are racialized, right? And Tairan mentioned that like when the Chinese American girl that she was working with, Chinese transnational girl that she was working with, like was one person at home. And then she was kind of limited to be a different person, right? Or positioned in a different way in schools. And I think that a lot of my current literacy work is looking at the ways that we conceptualize Asian diasporic youth and their bodies and in relation to the model minority and perpetual foreigner myths, right? So we really limit who Asian American, Asian diasporic youth can be and what their literacy practices can look like because we have an assumption that they're going to be in a specific way. And that doesn't allow us to recognize like Chile, Tairan was mentioning, right, her participants, like artistic expression and who she is as a person, because we really see that she can only be this type of like literate person or this type of student. And I think that there's a lot of work that we can do in that area. I do think, you know, there was talk about kind of how we bring theory into practice. I think both Jiadi and Tairan mentioned, right? And I think there has been progress in efforts to integrate Asian American histories and Asian American studies, ethnic studies, which can challenge some of these stereotypes. But we also see that there is pushback against that. And sometimes even when we bring in stories or Asian American histories, if we do that uncritically, it can actually perpetuate harmful narratives and harmful meaning making. So I think we are seeing an opening in considering more nuanced understandings of Asian diasporic communities, but that we have a lot of work to do in the field of literacies to kind of translate that work to make an actual difference in youth and communities' lives.
Much for sharing those valuable and important insights. What I have hearing across your conversation is that literacy for the community that you started is increasingly lived across like borders, languages, and everyday spaces, including different forms of literacy, dancing, music, cooking, and also family storytelling, etc. And it's not only confined to classroom or formal texts, like transnational, digital, and informal practices are not like only simply add-ons to academic literacy. There are also very important ways that people make meaning, sustain relationships, and also negotiate belonging, create solidarity and connection to each other. So this will lead to my next question. How do various literacy practices create possibilities for young people navigating multiple languages, cultures, and educational spaces especially in complex social or political times. And could you share a moment from your own research work that captures this?
To everyone, I feel like, but the example I want to give is a different one. So I hear joy. I think joy is so important. I feel like these days it's hard not to carry a heavy heart every day, even not the whole day, but part of the day. But joy and literacy is something I need to think more about and just attend to more and celebrate. And because of what you said, I thought about an event I went to 2 weeks ago. The teachers who were designing the MENA literature class also organized a MENA summit. So during the day, they had keynotes, they had workshops, they had at a high school, and they had a segment where the students from the fall class shared their migration stories, and then they had a fashion show that combined dance and fashion. And the fashion is like it's a hybridity of their connections to different cultures and both historical, contemporary, and the dance moves are also historical and contemporary. So I was reflecting with the teachers afterwards about how they are telling stories of movement and migration and identity through their dance and music. And it was happy, it was joyful, it was beautiful, and just yeah. So I was thinking, in this time of real violence, right, toward immigrant communities and their allies, incessant violence, at this time of U.S. imperialism, of blatant, just exertion of brute force, what kind of literacies are we uplifting, are we using to resist, to survive, to work toward change, to bring our communities together? I feel like I really appreciate what the educators are doing in their own spaces, and I think about also the idea. We just read one piece in the class I'm teaching on fractal, seeing culture as through a fractal metaphor. And I'm thinking, how do we see change as fractal, as seeing all these spaces of people working together? How do we borrow from each other? How do we connect with each other and bring about, a larger vision, a larger picture of what we can do together?
When I see this question, it reminds me of a very unique experience I had when I was doing my dissertation project. So my dissertation is a 3-year-long critical ethnography in a Chinese heritage school. But during that time, I was not only a researcher, I was also a teacher in that school. So I remember one of the unit of the class is about Chinese folktales, and I was teaching about the journey to the West. And honestly, when I went into the classroom, I was thinking I'm going to teach the most authentic story of the journey to the West, so the students can feel the beauty of the Chinese folktale, right? Then, we read picture books, we watched the movies, we watched cartoons, like a lot of, different multimodal text. And after that, I invite students to rewrite the story with comic strips. Surprisingly, most of the students incorporated not only language, right? Like, because they are bilinguals, they use both Chinese and English, but most of the students also incorporate a lot of Western cultures and characters in the story. So you can see Monkey King is fighting together with Spider-Man. So I was like Tairan mentioned earlier, it's a journey of learning and unlearning, right? So at that moment, it really challenged my assumptions and monolingual ideologies, monoglossic ideologies, right? When I was thinking of teaching the authentic Chinese folktale, what my students showed me was how they use this as a chance to express their bilingual and bicultural identities. So that really makes me think, kind of like the place we situate currently. When you go to the US social media, you might see a lot of hateful discourses about China, about Chinese people. And similarly, when you go to the Chinese social media, you might see a lot of hateful discourse about US, about American people. So I think, what does it mean when we create a space for Chinese Americans to use literacy to express who they are? Maybe they do not need to align with one named language or one country. Maybe they can love both Chinese and US. Maybe they can feel they are being loved by the people in both China and the US, right? So I think that is one way to help young people to navigate their identity and to express who they are in the current complex social and political times. And I think parents and teachers should not be the person to tell them the answer, because I had conversations with parents. Some parents will say, I hope my son could identify himself as a Chinese or American, right? I don't think we have the right to help our children or students identify who they are, but rather we should create the space, right? Give them the literacy practice opportunities to allow them to explore who they are.
I really think that I have found that when we follow the youth are so wise and they really can lead the way, and they are we have so much to learn from youth, particularly in the field of literacies and youth literacy practices. And what you said, Jiadi, make me think of Zixin's work with Asian diasporic youth on social media and what she's found and what we've been working through around how social media can be an agentive space for Asian diasporic youth to find or create belonging and maintain connections to their bicultural, bilingual identities, right? Particularly during times of major transition, like between high school and college, right, as they're going to different spaces, or in transnational transitions as well, right, that they can maintain connections with community through various social media platforms, right, and perhaps like navigating really expertly in ways that I think that those of us who are older, like I've realized I'm very much an old lady, right, like do not like do with the same amount of skill, right, and I think that is really critical, this like critical digital literacy engagement or this social media agentive space for Asian diasporic youth. It's super critical in this current complex socio-political time, because I think that our youth are very wise in actually knowing like, oh, that's definitely AI generated. Like I actually find that youth are smarter than some adults about saying, no, that's not possible. That's definitely AI, or that's a deep fake, or I don't believe this, or like navigating, oh, this source, like I've seen this in like 3 other places. Like they're actually really engaging in super complex digital literacy practices that are very critical. And they're also using social media spaces to connect with others who are like-minded, even if they're not in their direct space, which like, what a cool thing that there is that opportunity now. Whereas like when I was growing up, because I am an old lady, like I felt very alone, right? I mean, of the 4 of us, like I'm Asian American, I'm US born, and growing up in very non-Asian spaces, right? Predominantly white spaces. Like I felt like I was the only person. I didn't know how to connect to my heritage, culture, or identity. These are things that I've had to reclaim as an adult, right? Like in my late 30s, early 40s, right? And so I just think, even though this is a very complex, like socio-political time, youth are so wise and savvy and have so many more opportunities to connect with the wholeness of their humanity and with others who share their humanity and can navigate that in really strategic ways. So
thank you all, like especially Jiadi, for sharing your experiences and learnings from teaching COG, and Betina for you sharing about just valuing the wholeness of youth literacy practices and youth themselves as humans. But I like in my sharing of my story, I really want to echo Eva about centering joy in these moments. So like what really stood out to me in this question was how do these youth use these literacy practices, especially in the complex social and political times right now. So during that first study, it was during the first Trump administration. And then my second study is during the second Trump administration. So there were a lot of stuff that we had to deal with and navigate. The anti-Blackness sentiments, the anti-immigrant sentiments, and now beyond beyond just targeting immigrants, but targeting anyone that stands up for immigrants and protects immigrants. It's very scary to me, moments like these. So I want to share a few things that I learned from the girls that I worked with for my Transnational Girls of Color project. The two key words that really stood out to me in working with them was community and joy. So thinking about community, the girls engage in community building outside of our cohort, like our collective space, right? There's girls, Latino girls who translate ballads and translate ballots for the elders, Spanish-speaking elders in their communities to get people to go out to vote. They're engaged in a lot of student-run organizations like the Gay Straight Alliance. And two other girls, they also built a new organization in their school focused on mental health for immigrant women. Like, these are the critical literacy practices that the girls are engaging in and that are making change in their communities and society, right? And then thinking about so they do all these things in their communities, and then they come in our space, in the workshops, and they talk about these things. They build community with each other. A lot of the girls said, like when the Muslim girl, the Pakistani girl, shared about gendered expectations for her as a Muslim girl, the South Asian, the Indian girl chimed in, the Latino girls chimed in and said, we have similar expectations in our cultures, and they really appreciate the space to just talk to each other about the similarities of expectations and how they can push against that. And then the girls go out of the space and they engage in solidarity and advocacy online by keeping to talk about Palestine, talking about gun control, reposting Zora Mamdani's memes. All these things are their engagement in critical literacy. So joy. So that's the community part that I really learned from the girls I worked with. And then thinking about the joy part, it's really the humor that came through. And then one moment I want to share is, and this was actually inspired by Eva, because I prepared another moment to share, but then Eva said, yeah, like, let's think about joy. I looked on my office wall and then I saw this map. Can I share my screen, please? I think Betina's seen this map before. So I see this. So this map is hung on my wall, but this was a map that we did in our workshop. So the girls put down pins of places that are important to them, in different colors, and then they connected these dots on the world map that that are of importance to them with yarn, and then they did storytelling while they were connecting the dots. But this workshop, when we made this map, it was last July, and it was just the start of the current administration's immigration crackdown, and a lot of things were going on. And then the girls were like, yeah, India is important, Houston is important, but Greenland, funnily, like, Greenland is also important. I want to move to Greenland. That's like my plan B, so I don't know if they still think that now, but just the girls, there's so much stuff that's happening to them at school, in their personal lives. Like, there's so much aggression towards them from society and political parties, no matter, Democrats or Republicans. But they're dealing with all of this with so much grace and humor. And that's something that I'm really learning from the girls, is how do we deal with it with joy and humor.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and research. What I'm hearing across your work is that everyday and transnational literacy practices do not just help young people cope with complexity, they actively create space for agency, belonging, voice, and joy. Whether through multilingual storytelling, digital connections with families and peers across borders, classroom dialogue, cultural representation in text, or dance and fashion shows, these practices become ways for youth to claim authorship over who they are, how they are seen, and the joy they experience in expressing themselves. With that in mind, I'd like to turn our attention from what these literacy practices make possible for young people to how we as researchers and educators position ourselves in relation to the communities we study. As scholars working closely with communities, children, and young people, how does your own positionality shape the way you study and interpret literacy, and what does care look like in your research, relationships, and practices?
Well, thinking about how my positionality shapes my work and what does care look like, I really want to add another layer to positionality, which is relationality. Responding to the call to thinking about relationality and our positionality by Dr. Kathy De Los Rios and Lee Patel in their article in the International Qualitative Studies in Education Journal. So I really think about, I approach my work with the ethics of care that I want to be present, right? Like I want to be present for my communities, either if it's before the study, during the study, after the study. I still talk to all of my research partners after the study ended. But care is also food. It's exchanging food with the research partners, eating together around a dinner table, cooking together, breaking bread together. Another layer of care I think about is really the problematizing and challenging problems in my own community. For example, like anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiments, proximity to whiteness. These are care. And it's care for the people that I'm working with, the Chinese communities, Asian communities, but it's care for all other people of color, or people of the global majority. And to me, that's a very important layer for me in thinking about care in my research. And then also thinking about care as amplifying stories, because as researchers and people with PhDs, we hold a lot of privilege in the sense that people think what you say, most people probably think what you say a little smarter because you have that credential, you have that systemic or institutional acknowledgement, you hold the wisdom. And I fully acknowledge that privilege. And so another layer of care in thinking about my research is how do I use my privilege to amplify the stories, to build the stage for these immigrants to tell their stories and show their lived experiences and how it pertains to literacy and education. And then, I come to this understanding of care really through just teachings growing up, like what I mentioned earlier, gossiping with my family, telling stories, eating every weekend. I grew up in a really big family in China. I saw my aunts and uncles and grandparents every single weekend. So that's my positionality and how I come to the work I do and think about care.
Really resonant with me because I know both of us do ethnography. And for ethnographer, it really takes, a lot of time, love, and energy to build a long-term relationship with the community we work with. So for me, I think care really means slowing down, listening carefully, and contributing to long-term and in-depth relationships with my participants. And not only my participants, but also the overall community I work with. So take my dissertation as an example. So when because I did my PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Urbana-Champaign is a small college town, but it is very international and has a good number of Chinese American live locally. But when I was there, it's kind of like after COVID time, and I learned that the school has closed during the COVID because there's no financial and teaching support. And when I reached out to the principal, she was like, I'm the only person left in this school. I think it's time to close it because no one else can help. So I went to the university's librarian, and luckily I found a archive folder about this school. And I've learned that this school has more than 50 years history. And I learned the story where the professor, she is a professor in chemical engineering, and how she established this school from scratch just to build a space for her own children and her colleagues' children to learn Chinese. So I was like, we cannot just let it die, right? So I collaborated with the principal and brought the school back to life. So the school reopened in 2022, and since then I have served as a researcher and a teacher there until my graduation. So for me, I never see myself as an outsider, because I've literally spent my every Sunday afternoon in that school in the last 4 years with the teachers there, with the parents, and with the children there. So my dissertation. In my dissertation study, I observed other bilingual teachers, but I've also conducted a lot of practitioner research in that school. So the parents, the teachers, the students there, they also don't see me as outsider, because they see me as their teacher, their friends. They see me as someone who really care about this school, about this community. And I think that's the foundation of the trust. That's the reason why participants could share their struggles, their concerns with me. And also when I do my research analysis, I would bring my initial analysis with my teacher participants, and we will sit together. We will rewatch the teaching moment, and we will read my initial analysis, and we reflect together. So in my research, I really see this process as a journey for me and the teachers to learn together, to co-develop knowledge, rather than me just sitting there judging or critiquing them. So that's my understanding of care in research.
I really resonated with what both of you said, Tairan and Jiadi, in terms of the definition of care, right? So I think in terms of care, like not just in research, but in everything in my life, I really try to approach things with care. And for me, that care overlaps with the definitions that you all gave: respect, listening, seeking to understand, and really in terms of research, like positioning research as relational and not transactional, right? Acknowledging that there's an investment in the process of research by everybody who's a part of the process, and showing gratitude and respect for participants and what they've shared. I think particularly given the personal and narrative nature of literacies research, right, and research that I've engaged in, I think ongoing care is something that's really, really important. I think where I differ from the two of you is, when Jiadi was saying like she never feels like an outsider because she's like such embedded in like her community, like my whole life I felt like an outsider. And I think that really informs my positionality in the way that I do my work in Asian diasporic and Asian American communities, because I have felt so on the margins my whole life, right? So, I identify as a second generation Taiwanese American mother scholar, and I think all of those aspects of my identity really impact the work that I do. And I think that like my own immigrant mother, right, like having to, like being told in graduate school by her professors that the best way to ensure her children's future success was to ensure that I spoke accentless English, really set me on a path where aspirational whiteness or aspirational like assimilation was what I was told was the right way to be. And yet I never found full belonging in that experience, right? And so my own experiences of isolation and a lack of connection or pride in my identity, it has often made it hard to feel like I have, like I am the right one to work with Asian migrant or Asian diasporic communities, because my own grasp of my heritage languages is still very basic. So she knows, because she works with me regularly, like I have a lot of shame and a lot of like, sorry, I'm gonna get really emotional. Like just, I think that this research is very personal. And I think like when you go through language loss and cultural loss and like, it means that the research is part of who you are, right? So like literacies and the way that we shape our understandings of the world and of like the discourses that we take part in, they're not separate from us. And so I think really like about the human aspects of our work, right? And I think that having experienced that loss myself, alongside the loss of my parents, who were like really my connection to my own heritage community has really instilled this deep compassion and care for the experiences of Asian Americans, and like a real desire that Asian Americans and Asian diasporic folks like not be invisible anymore, right? That we actually, because our experiences are important, right? And when we can experience belonging, it's healing. It repairs us in a way that we didn't even know we needed, I think. And I think as a mother, that's especially important to me, because it's like I see my children now as multi-generational, multiracial Asian Americans, and I want them to understand the power that language and literacies has in their own lives and their relationships. And sorry, I am really emotional, but the other thing that has shaped my thinking recently is having, so I had never been to Taiwan or to China, which is where my family is from, before last year. And so I recently went back, and it really shaped the way I think about how we talk about the nuance of specific ethnic and cultural groups within the Asian diaspora, and intersectional identities and transnational generational literacies that really, I think, aren't understood outside in the wider literacies world, but that I think we have a very particular perspective and a responsibility to talk about.
What you said made me think about how, sharing our own stories with each other, with our research partners, with both youth, younger people whom we work with, and with educators and partners in design and change. How sharing our stories is so important. And when we share our stories, we realize that our sense of loss or our sense of vulnerability is something that we have in common across humans. And I want to give an example of from one observation and then just my own experience. So I talk about but it happened actually in the classroom and also at the large gathering of students at the MENA Summit recently, when the youth who shared the story with an audience of several hundred people, and these are high school kids, young people, right? And they talk about sense of loss and not being able to speak their native language or their parents' language very well. Echoed with the audience. At the end, there was an impromptu passing the mic to folks in the audience, and a number of people mentioned that not something similar to what Betina shared with us, that their parents wanted them to succeed and didn't, and they are teenagers, right? This generation of folks, and they didn't get to learn their native language. It happened in a classroom where we work too, and I realized, I speak Cantonese, but I don't speak Mandarin very well. So even within our community, in the Chinese community, there are just differences in experiences, and we can't have the same assumption of folks. But then I also, I want to share that there are lots of silent stories in my family. I didn't learn a lot about care in my family. I know my parents care for me, but in a very different way. My own diaspora journey actually went from China to Vietnam to Hong Kong to Macau, and a lot of these stories were buried. I didn't get to hear them. And so I when I talk to young people and with my educator colleagues, they share similar sense of gaps and silences in their own family history, and we talk to each other, and we uplift each other in terms of how this our identity, our history is a continuous journey. And I have found that sharing our stories as educational partners has been a key, essential part of change, of doing any work in classrooms and community.
Thank you all for sharing those reflections. They're very, very powerful and very, very personal, connected and narrative way. What stand out to me that positionality for scholars and care for scholars are not just like methodological consideration. They're also part of your literacy work itself. Like Dr. Chou mentioned, exchange food with participants, and both Dr. Zhang and Dr. Betina Hsieh shared the positionality, both as insider and outsider. How does that impact your research? And also, Dr. Lan shared like it's really important for us to share our stories with our participants, because being vulnerable to our participants also show our honest and human connect with each other, with our honesty, and be open to our participants. And as we begin to wrap up, we would love to ask one final question. So based on your research on literacy, what message or call to action would you like to share with researchers, policymakers, educators, or practitioners working to create more inclusive and culturally sustaining literacy environments, particularly for Asian diaspora communities?
I think my call is very simple. Start with what communities already know and do. Because I always feel for teachers, educators, policymakers, the first step is always to truly see those rich literacy practices our students are already doing in the classroom, and recognize those practices as legitimate, as valuable, as beautiful, not as deficit. So I think our job is to create a space that allows students to bring those practices into the classroom and build from that. And that also means giving students a little more trust and more room for agency. Although I know that sometimes feel very tricky for teachers when they feel they might lose the control, right? Out of control, and they might feel like they're losing their agency. But I think we do really need to give our students a little bit more trust and agency, and trusting that their language, their story, their own ways of meaning making are not obstacles to learning, but powerful resources for it.
Jiadi is saying, I want to build on what she said. So 2 calls to action that I'm thinking about. One is, yes, trusting the young people, trusting the families, because they're the experts of their lives and literacy practices. So I'm thinking, listen to what they need. Like start going and talking to them and be like, what do you need for us to do in this school district, in this classroom? And then using that as the basis for pedagogical designing or curriculum designing or policy change. Another thing I'm thinking about and contending with, and I love to hear what you all think about it, is really including the voices of Asian diaspora communities in talking about, I don't want to use the word DEI, like the huge umbrella term, but in thinking about social change and what students can be that need more support, really include the voices of Asian diaspora communities. And I'm saying this because there's this thing that happened. I don't know if I want to share it. Should I share it? I can share it. So I was at this conference last week, a few weeks ago. I don't remember. Time is relevant. Time is a mush. But a few weeks ago, it's the local school district had a conference in collaboration with my institution to talk. So a lot of superintendents came, researchers came, teachers came to just talk about what it means to work together to help the students. And there was a presentation, and it was titled "How to Work with Diverse Black, Latina, and Multilingual Students." And this is a district that has a huge population of Asian immigrants, either from the older generation immigrants or the new generation Silicon Valley tech boom Asian immigrants. And I brought up something in our small group talk, in our small group conversation. I was like, I'm wondering, where are the Asian students in this conversation? And I said it not to be like, resources is a pie, and how come you get two pies and I only get 0 pies? I'm not saying it in a competitive manner, but I'm saying it in the sense that I don't want Asian students to be minimized to think to being the model minority, so they're struggle free. Their parents work in the Silicon Valley, so they have a lot of money. Like I don't want their experiences and literacy practices to be erased in these conversations. And also there's so much nuance in the Asian community, right? Like even just between East Asian communities with South Asian, Southeast Asian communities, like our struggles, our experiences, our literacy practices are all so different. So I share that I share that story and experience to say that I really hope researchers, policymakers, educators, and practitioners can approach literacies and literacy education as a cross-racial solidarity project. Like how can we build on each other's wisdom and geniuses to all grow and thrive?
Experiences of Asian diasporic communities in the different spaces we work in, but also in collaboration with others. In some spaces, Asian experiences are overrepresented but in a lot of spaces they are also invisibilized, right? So I think working with colleagues and with educators, educational leaders, communities is really important to problematize the way Asian communities are positioned. I've seen presentations that kind of scholarship that look at Asian students as really having this privilege, right? Mm-hmm. And these studies are done by folks we align with in terms of what the critical work that we want to do. But then we also what Tairan, you pointed out, there are also problematic parts in the ideologies in our community in terms of how we position ourselves to other groups, right? Mm-hmm. Other racialized groups, kind of anti-Blackness and colorism and classism within our community. We need to work both within and across communities.
Yeah, I totally hear that, Eva, and I totally agree with you that there are so many spaces where Asian voices, especially East Asian voices, are privileged and overrepresented, right? And I totally believe that we need to make space for Black African American communities and also the Latina community and indigenous community to, we need to make space for them and their experiences and their stories. And that's why, treating literacy education as a cross-racial solidarity project, by learning from these other communities, then the Asian communities will know, when is their time to shine and when is their time to just sit down and shut up and listen, right? Like it's really important to just learn from each other and build through coalition. That at least that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I was thinking, Tairan, just about that and about how I think a lot of that stems from this idea, this scarcity model, right? That we have to take up space, otherwise we'll never be seen, right? And that dichotomy in terms of East Asian and Asian diasporic kind of overrepresentation, because so often we are invisibilized, right? That when we have space, it's like we've got to take it. But I think that kind of leads into, right, what my response to this question was, right? So I think it is really important that we listen and see Asian diasporic communities and see them in their diversity and not as a monolith, that we be willing to unlearn the stereotypes and lenses with which people might approach various Asian diasporic communities. And I think there are different stereotypes for different Asian diasporic communities. So again, even that is not monolithic. We talk a lot about model minority and about perpetual foreigner, but that doesn't necessarily fit with every Asian diasporic sub-community. But I think that what you all three of you were talking about that I've been thinking about a lot lately is belonging, right? And how being seen and affirmed in the wholeness of one's humanity is something that is really missing. And that's my greatest wish for Asian diasporic communities, because I think that it really will help us to build stronger bridges, right? So I was thinking, this is a really hard question for me because I don't like to tell people what to do. But I think like in terms of a call to action or a message, I really have a wish that Asian diasporic people would have access to see diverse forms of our own humanity reflected to us in the world and in the words around us, and that we could look at those representations critically, that our stories, histories, and languages would be readily available to us, and that we would be able to create possible futures beyond the limited positions that we've been allowed to be a part of, which I think also includes like we have to be either white adjacent or we can't be in existence, right? Or we have to dominate, we have to be this. But I think that there is a world that is so much more. And I think that if we had that understanding of our own humanity and our positionality within the world, it would enable us to work in greater solidarity with other communities towards a more just participatory world. I think that if Asian diasporic communities, if people, individuals are able to see, know, and love ourselves, we can draw from our shared humanity to build stronger bridges with other communities, with other people. And so, I mean, I think that that is what I hope that we would be able to make space for in order for us to work in greater coalition.
Thank you so much for your insight. Across your insight, I'm hearing a shared call to begin with trust, trusting young people, their families, and their communities as experts in their own literacy practices, and truly seeing what they already know and do from an asset-based perspective. This means creating a learning environment that value and build on these everyday and transnational meaning-making practices, recognizing them as a powerful resources for learning. At the same time, it also means working collectively with educators, leaders, and communities to challenge the ways Asian and Asian diasporic communities have been positioned, often rendered invisible, and to center their diverse voices, experiences, and cross-racial solidarities in curriculum and schooling. Together, this perspective invites us to reimagine literacy education as grounded in trust, visibility, and social change. We've heard today about many ways Asian and Asian diasporic communities cultivate connection and belonging through their literacy practices across digital spaces, classroom, community networks, and transnational ties. These practices highlight multiple ways of knowing, being, and storytelling, showing how literacy can foster agency and resilience across generation and cultural contexts. We are deeply grateful to our scholars for sharing their time, their research, and reflection, and their stories on what it means to study and support literacy in culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Inquiring Minds, focused on Asian diasporic understanding of literacy and transnational meaning making. And a heartfelt thank you to our participants for such an engaging and insightful conversation. We've truly enjoyed learning from these amazing scholars, and we hope our listeners with new perspectives and questions to carry forward. Thank you so much.